الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh everyone. Today we are going to be refuting a video made by Testify. It's actually his most viewed video in which he explains how the crucifixion dilemma debunks or destroys Islam. So we are going to be reacting to that video and refuting the many lies made by this individual. So without further ado, hope you guys enjoy this video and Bismillah, let's go.
While the Quran claims that Jesus wasn't crucified, early Islamic scholars have proposed that somebody else took his place on the cross. But if this is true, then why did the disciples believe and preach that Jesus was crucified and resurrected? This discrepancy raises a serious question about the very foundation of Islam itself.
Okay, so you're saying that Jesus was crucified because the disciples taught that he was crucified? Okay, and why do you believe in these so called disciples? You got this information from your Bible, and your Bible is clearly not a reliable source because of the many contradictions and errors found within it, such as 2 Kings 8:26 contradicting 2 Chronicles 22:2, and many more. So, why do you believe that these disciples are who they claim they are? Not to mention, the so called authors of your Bible are also anonymous. You don't know who John was, or Mark was, or who Matthew was. You don't know their biographies. You don't even know their full names. So, the fact that you're relying on them to know who the disciples were, what they taught, what they preached, etc., is kind of ridiculous to me because you don't have any evidence to back that claim up.
When we read Surah 4, 157, it says, "But they neither killed nor crucified him. It was only made to appear so." Even those who argue for this crucifixion are in doubt. They have no knowledge whatsoever, only making assumptions. They certainly did not kill him. Muslims obviously take this at face value to mean that Jesus wasn't actually crucified. The traditional view is that somebody else was made to look like Jesus and took his place on the cross. This interpretation is backed by early Islamic sources like Ibn Abbas, a companion of the Prophet Muhammad. According to one account, it reads, "Just before God took Jesus up to heaven, Jesus went to his 12 disciples. His hair was dripping with water, as if he had just bathed, and he said, 'One of you will disbelieve in me 12 times after having believed.' Then he asked, 'Who among you will volunteer to be transformed to look like me and be killed in my place? Whoever volunteers will be with me in heaven.' A young disciple offered 3 times, and on the third, Jesus accepted. The resemblance of Jesus was cast over him, while Jesus ascended to heaven through a hole in the roof. When the authorities came, they found the young man and crucified him, thinking he was Jesus." Some Muslims will go ahead and argue that if this is true, then how could anyone really tell the difference between the real Jesus being crucified or someone who just looked like him? To most people watching, it would all be the same, whether it was the actual Jesus, a lookalike, or even an illusion from Allah. It would have all been recorded the same way. Therefore, checkmate Christians, our perfect book is right, and your corrupt book is wrong. But here's the twist. If we go with the story from Ibn Abbas, the disciples knew that somebody else had taken Jesus' place on the cross. Yet, all of the available historical data shows that the disciples believed Jesus himself was crucified. This is puzzling because according to the Quran, the disciples were Muslims. If they believed Jesus was crucified, does that mean they were deceived by Allah?
Who told you that the disciples believed that Jesus was crucified? Oh, the Bible, the same book which has many contradictions within it and is written by anonymous authors who you don't even know the full names of. So, again, how do you know that the disciples believed that Jesus was crucified? You don't. All of this stuff you are saying, you are getting it from your Bible, which is not a reliable source on historical matters.
How do we know the disciples believed that Jesus was crucified? The Gospels, which are based on their testimonies, indicate that Jesus died on the cross. For instance, Mark's Gospel historically linked to the Apostle Peter, and John's Gospel linked to the beloved disciple who was also present at the cross, both recount Jesus' crucifixion. The speeches in the book of Acts and the letters from the apostles, like Paul, also focus on Jesus' death and resurrection. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, Paul emphasizes the crucifixion and resurrection, a belief shared by the early Christian community. We talked about the problem that Paul poses for Muslims in the previous video. A further problem with the idea of substitution is why it was necessary for someone to take Jesus' place. Why not just have Jesus escape? Why put somebody, especially a loyal disciple, through such a painful and humiliating death if it wasn't even essential? It seems like this view is just a weak apologetic attempt to counter the very strong evidence that Jesus did in fact die by crucifixion, a fact acknowledged by the vast majority of biblical scholars and historians.
Again, you don't know who Mark was, you don't know who Matthew was, you don't know who any of these people were because you don't have their biographies, you don't have their last names, and you have absolutely zero authentic chain of transmissions which go from John, Luke, Mark, Matthew all the way back to Jesus. You don't have any of that. So on what basis are you saying that these anonymous people are reliable? Quote unquote anonymous, they were called anonymous by your scholars too. So on what basis are you relying on these people? And also, it was necessary to find a replacement for Jesus because if they didn't and God just lifted Jesus up to heaven, then the Romans would have suspected that one of the disciples were hiding Jesus and all of them would have gotten punished or crucified for it. So it was better to just give out one volunteer instead of have the whole group of disciples punished by the cruel Romans. And also, even if this is not true, even if there was no replacement of Jesus, we can still say that no one was crucified that day. No one was crucified that day. And we can actually back this up by evidence because the Romans were extremely good in documenting historical events, especially within their empire. And there is not a single Roman record that talks about a man known as Jesus being crucified in Roman Palestine. There is no evidence of that happening. So, yes, on what basis do you even think that he was crucified when we have no evidence whatsoever? Oh, wait, you also said that historians believe that Jesus was crucified, right? Well, guess what? That actually falls in line with the Quran. The Quran says that people would think that he is crucified. They would be made, Jesus would be made to appear that he is being crucified. Therefore, people will think that he is crucified. The fact that these historians think he was crucified is actually affirming the Quran. So, yes, you have no evidence of the crucifixion, you have no evidence to prove that the Bible is reliable, and you have no evidence from historical records that show that the crucifixion even happened.
And here is a tricky catch-22 for Muslims. If Jesus wasn't crucified, then either he was wrong about predicting his death, which would undermine his role as a prophet in Islam, or he actually was crucified, which would contradict the Quran's account. Think about it. If Jesus didn't die on the cross, it makes him a false prophet, meaning Islam is false since they regard Jesus as a prophet. But if he did die, it goes against the Quran, which also means that Islam is false. There's no easy way around this dilemma for Muslims. I think most Muslims would argue that Jesus didn't actually predict his own death as the Gospels claim, and these are just supposed Bible corruptions. But let's dive into some of the evidence that shows that he really did make these predictions. During Jesus' trial, false witnesses claimed that he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Later, they mocked him on the cross, saying, "Who would destroy this temple and rebuild it in 3 days? Save yourself." This sounds really weird because neither Mark nor Matthew give any context for why people would say this. However, if we turn over to John's Gospel, we get the backstory. In John 2:18 through 19, when Jesus was asked for a sign, he said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Here, Jesus was referring to his own body and his resurrection, not the literal temple. So John provides the pretext for the accusation that's hinted in Mark and Matthew's account. This kind of fit between different accounts, where one explains details that the others leave hanging, is known as an undesigned coincidence. It suggests that these accounts are independent and based on real events, lending credibility to the story. Another example is when Jesus predicted his death and resurrection in Mark 8:31 through 33, saying he would be killed and rise after 3 days. Peter, not understanding, rebuked Jesus, but Jesus firmly corrected him, saying, "Get behind me, Satan." This sharp rebuke would be embarrassing and therefore an unlikely detail for the early Christians to invent, especially given Peter's prominence, suggesting that this was based in real events. The numerous predictions and detailed accounts of Jesus' impending death and resurrection are just too compelling to be dismissed as mere inventions. Therefore, there's no escaping this dilemma. Either Jesus didn't die by crucifixion, which would invalidate his prophecy and make him a false prophet, making Islam false, or he did die by crucifixion, directly contradicting the Quran and making Islam false. Either way, Islam is false.
Or it could be that Jesus never made a prophecy about being crucified because you got that information from the Bible, which I just explained is unreliable because you have zero authentic chain of transmission going from John, Luke, Mark, Matthew, all the way back to Jesus. So that's one. Two, no, Jesus was not crucified because there is no historical evidence to suggest that he was crucified. Even the Romans didn't have any evidence, so I don't know on what basis you are saying there is any evidence for that. So let's recap over here. One, there was no prophecy made by Jesus because no evidence except a unreliable book. So your first claim goes out the window. Two, Jesus was not crucified because there is no evidence of him being crucified. So your second claim also goes out the window. So overall, you did nothing throughout this whole video but blindly relying on the Bible, which I just proved is not reliable because of the anonymous authors, zero authentic chain of transmissions, and because of the corruptions and contradictions within it. So congratulations for wasting 5 to 10 minutes of my time. But yeah, I hope this video benefited a lot of people, and I hope I helped debunk this lie about Islam. So until next time, guys, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Jazakallahu khair.
الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم